What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Jimmy James 59, and today going to be doing a civilization concept overview of the Vandals. So let's go ahead, jump in, see what we got in store for you. So we're going to have a deep dive here, going to be giving you a little bit of history, talk about whether we should have this civ or not, what it should look like, think about how we balance it, talk about strategies, and then at the end I'll tell you some ideas that I came up with but decided to deviate away from, and also think about how my civ design for the Vandals relates to some others that I found online. Now, what I will also say is this video is not a history lesson. I did spend some time diving into history and reading some journal articles, some book excerpts, some online sites, and also listening to a few YouTube channels even. There's actually some great YouTube channels out there like Kings and Generals and this guy Marianus, who has a channel that's solely dedicated to the Western Roman Empire. Now, the reason I did that is not so that I could provide you a complete and thorough history of the Vandals, but it's so that I could use it as inspiration to basically think about what they would look like in the game and try to make them a civ that's fun to play, that is different than the other civs in the game, and help me try to balance them as well. So to give you some history of the civ, just very briefly, the Vandals, as you can see from this graphic, they really get around town, probably migrating out of Scandinavia early on, settling into Poland. They fight both for and against the Roman Empire for a time, and because the Vandals are probably multiple tribes at this point. But when the Huns start moving west, that pushes the Vandals and many other peoples even further west, and that means the Vandals expand down into Gaul and also into the Iberian Peninsula. And fun piece of trivia, Andalusia, Spain that we know today, the term Andalusia is probably derived from the word Vandal, so that's says something about their presence in the region. But the Vandals keep moving south, and they wind up establishing a kingdom in North Africa from which they could really control the Mediterranean. And they kick out the Romans in the process, which is a pretty big deal because North Africa was a major economic hub for the Romans at that time, and now the Vandals had access to it. So this really gives them a lot of power, a lot of wealth, and influence. And for the Vandals, they translate that into continued successes that you might argue culminates in the sack of Rome in 455 AD. The Visigoths did something similar 4 decades earlier, but the Vandal effort is on a much higher scale. The Visigoth sack lasted about, I think, 3 days, and the Vandal sack of Rome occurs over about a 2-week period. So, they're really stepping their game up. They get a number of victories in this time, especially on water against both the Western and the Eastern Roman empires. But where it all falls apart is when Belisarius rolls in and defeats the Vandals in the 6th century AD, and they pretty much are wiped off of the historical map at that point, and that ends their story. So we can think now about why we might want them in the game and why we might not want to include them. And I think the best arguments for them is that they're really important at this time, and they have contact with a number of civs that are already in the game. I was actually surprised to think about how many of the civilizations that we have in AOE2 DE that are either very active in the early Middle Ages and really probably hitting their stride, and are also getting started and still important players, right? So that is something that kind of surprised me, and I think that there is something of either an acceptance or an acquiescence, depending on your point of view, that we can draw civilizations from the early Middle Ages. Hopefully we will only do so when those civilizations are important. And I think fortunately for the Vandals, they are a very important regional power at this time, and their migration patterns give them a really interesting story to tell. And one possible campaign is to cover the life of King Gyseric, who reigned for nearly 50 years, which is incredible to think about at the time. So yeah, I think there's a lot you could work with the civ. Now, if I was going to pitch the arguments against, I would say that the civ isn't a regional power for very long, and they pretty much fall off the map while we're still in the early Middle Ages. So you might argue then that they're just not around for long enough in the time frame. However, my verdict is to go ahead and include them. I think they're too interesting, and I think that they're also pretty important. And given their story, I do think we could develop a pretty interesting identity for them, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. I also think we could consider also adding in the Allens, a people who the Vandals have something of a political bromance with, and do that all in one DLC that is barbarian themed. But that's something to talk about at a later time. So, what are we going to do with the Vandals? What should they look like? Well, the first thing we need to do is make sure they don't look too much like other barbarians like the Goths and the Huns, and then some civilizations that maybe are a bit earlier on, haven't hit their sweet spot, the Franks and the Burgundians that are also in a similar geographic area and also roaming around. No pun intended. Now, we have a few touch points we can do this on. Vandal armies were really dominated by cavalry once they start to hit their stride, so that makes them different than Goths, but they didn't necessarily have mounted archers, and so that can make them different from the Huns, so we could keep that in mind as we're designing the Civ. Additionally, they should be good in the water because they're racking up a number of victories on the water at this time, so let's bake that in. And then the next thing I want to think about here is, remember, right, when the Vandals are really at their high water mark, they have that kingdom in North Africa, and it is the case that you had North African tribes, particularly the Moors, who were fighting in the Vandal army at that time. It's also the case that the Vandals also fought against some other Moorish tribes as well, but we would have some of that sort of a different style of warfare being fought that would be fought by peoples in North Africa being baked into the Vandal army at some level. And I think if we can fuse that sort of Germanic with the North African tech tree, you bake all this together, and I think now we have a civilization that's worth talking about. And the other thing that we want to keep in mind is that if we consider the possibility of adding the Allens later, we would probably want to see Vandals and Allens be played together in team games out there on the ladder. So we want to make sure that those civilizations would be distinct. But again, talk about the Allens more at a later time. Okay, so what I want to do now is run through the civilization bonuses, and I'm going to do these quickly, but I'm going to talk about each one in detail once we get through this little summary here. So, the Vandals are a cavalry and naval civilization, and their civ bonuses are as follows. Town centers produce a slow trickle of food. Gambesons affects light cavalry and camel riders. Fire ships and dromons have plus 20% HP. The civilization has access to free shipwright, and the team bonus is that enemy trade carts are slowed down by 33%. Okay, let's talk about that economic bonus that town centers produce a slow trickle of food, and as you can see, the amount of food that's produced slows down as you move through the ages. What we want to express here is the fact that the Vandals really migrated, as you saw in the graphic from earlier, across the map. And so when you're putting down town centers in Age of Empires 2, it kind of reflects that. So this is a nice place where gameplay and history, we can kind of synergize those things. In terms of the implications, I'll spell this out a bit more with reference to some other civs so you can get more of a sense of where I think the Vandals probably rank economically. But basically, it's a good food bonus early, and it's a decent bonus in the mid game, but it's really weak in the late game. And I'm going to compare them now with the Lithuanians and the Hindustanis. So starting off with the Lithuanians, I'm going to look at early, mid, and late game and think about how both the Vandals and the Lithuanians compare to generic civilizations. In the early game, right, once you hit feudal age, Lithuanians are plus 100 food compared to a generic civ, and the Vandals, if you're going up on, say, 1920 pop, are going to be up about 90 food, so the Lithuanians have a little bit of an edge there. In the mid game, you have to remember, right, Lithuanians get their food in chunks when they get TCs. Vandal TCs, though, are going to be creating that small trickle of food the whole time. So, when Lithuanians, right, you have to build another TC, and that'll get you to plus 200 food. And if you put 2 down, now you're at plus 300. Now, when the Vandals hit Castle Age, if you hit around 20 minutes, assuming you hit Feudal Age around the 9-minute mark, you'll be up about 180 food compared to a generic Civ. So, right, the Lithuanians, if they put down that TC, right, can kind of catch back up and maybe get a little bit ahead. However, if the Vandals put down 2 TCs immediately, you're going to get that plus 300 probably before the 30-minute mark at some point. And that would probably be before you would want to put down that 4th TC, unless you're on a map maybe where you're booming, right? So I think on open maps, Vandals can actually pretty confidently get ahead of Lithuanians in terms of food eco in the mid game. And remember, right, the more TCs you make with the Vandals, the more food you're going to get. Now in the late game, you're probably going to wind up with 4 to 5 TCs, so the Lithuanians probably cap out at about 400 to 500 food. And for the Vandal player, it really just depends. If the Vandal player plays a more all-in 1 TC in the mid game, maybe you would not have as much food as, say, a Lithuanian player. On the other hand, right, if you put down those TCs in the mid game, you're probably going to get ahead of them. Now let me look at the Hindustanis. So the Hindustanis in the early game are actually outpaced by the Vandals, who are going to be probably 25 to 30 food ahead. And in the mid game, hitting Castle Age, Hindustanis and Vandals should have pretty similar amounts of food. The Hindustanis might be a little bit ahead at this point, so keep that in mind. That probably though pretty even. Now, where we really start to see a change is when we think about how Castle Age plays out. A Hindustani town center in Castle Age is, assuming no idle time, basically saving 22 food per minute. That's really impressive, actually. And if you think about that as 3 TCs, then Hindustanis are saving something like 65 food per minute, where Vandals on 3 TCs are really only gaining 12 food per minute. So it's not nearly as good of a bonus as the Hindustanis. Now, if we think about the late game, Hindustanis are saving about, 28 food per minute, but you're going to hit a population ceiling at some point. So where it really comes in here is that if you're having to continually remake a lot of villagers because you're being raided, this is a big advantage to the Hindustanis. But if the fighting is occurring mostly in the open field and the villagers are safe, Vandals are going to get that slow trickle of food. It's not a huge advantage, but it's still a little something. Alright, let's talk about our military bonus now, or at least one of our military bonuses. And this is a good land military bonus, and that's that Gambesons affects light cavalry and camel riders. What we want to reflect here is that the Vandals were really good horsemen when they're at their peak, and they had Moorish auxiliaries in their army, and that would mean that they would have some decent light cavalry and camels. What does this give the civilization? Well, the light cavalry are going to be really strong versus archers, both in the mid game and late game. You can think about this kind of like Turks, except that Turks are getting the light cav upgrade for free. And I will say in the late game, just to give you a little bit of preview on the tech tree, the Vandals don't get Hussar, but you do get full upgrades otherwise. So your light cavalry are still going to be pretty strong versus archers, but not quite on the level of, say, Turks or Tatars. When we think about the camels now, right? Camels are going to be slightly stronger versus archers in the mid game, but if you know from playing, say, like knights with only +1 armor, you know that crossbows are still pretty good against that. So they're not going to be, eating a bunch of arrow shots. And additionally, in the late game, this civ doesn't get heavy camel rider, so you have Vandal camel riders, but with an extra pierce armor, and that means that they take about as many arrows as a generic heavy camel rider. But there's a little bit more to the explanation of that story coming up a bit later in the video, so keep watching. Now I want to talk about how the civ plays out on water with the military bonus, fire ships and dromons having more HP. What I want to do here is reflect the usage of fire ships that the Vandal fleets made, that they employed on the water. Now, it's probably true that the fire ships that were used were much more like demolition ships that we have in the game, but I just felt that the demolition ship, in terms of how many ways it could have bonuses, it's kind of tapped out in my view, and I decided I'd just keep it fire ships, even though we're deviating from history a bit. But remember, we want to think about gameplay. What does this mean? This means that you're going to have a civilization that is pretty strong both on open water maps and hybrid maps, because on hybrid maps like Four Lakes, you tend to see a lot more fire ship play. And in the late game, well, it's going to really depend on how the Vandal player handles galleons and demolition ship unit compositions, so we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to the tech tree. Now, let me talk about the other water bonus here, and that's free shipwright. This is really a good bonus and is meant to reflect the fact that the Vandals really started amassing a levy kind of later on in their history. They captured a Roman fleet as well when they conquered North Africa, so that was pretty wild, and so I think we have the historical justification here to give them that free shipwright. Now, what does it give the Civ? Well, it's a great power spike in early Imperial Age, and the Vandals are a civilization that's going to rely a lot more on fire ships, which have to be able to close that distance. So having the HP bonus and free shipwright should help you facilitate having that larger navy and probably having to replace these units maybe a bit more than, say, you're relying on a more ranged naval unit like galleons. And lastly, talk about the team bonus. The team bonus is that you have enemy trade carts being slowed down by 33%. Basically, if you're up against a Spanish player, reversing that bonus. The idea here is Vandals need to be good at raiding the opponent, and this is going to do two things. One, it's going to reduce your enemy's trade income, which is pretty sweet, and it's also going to make it easier because the trade units are moving slower for units, especially those that have to path around, objects in the game to attack, like melee cavalry. It's going to make it a lot easier for them to catch up to those trade carts and take them out. Now that we've walked through the civilization bonuses, I want to introduce you to the Vandals' unique unit, the Gaudraut. The Gaudraut is a medium cavalry unit that gains bonus damage versus infantry as it accumulates kills. One of these stats that Age of Empires 2 tracks for each unit is how many units it's actually killed, and what we want to do is use that mechanic to make a unique unit that is really unlike any other that we have in the game. The Gaudraut costs 65 food and 55 gold, and the upgrade costs 950 food, 650 gold, so it's affordable, but not necessarily cheap. With Bloodlines, right, the regular version has 135 HP, and the elite version has 160, so this is a unit that has some durability to it. Now, the base damage in the regular is only 8, and for the elite it's 10, and this is why I consider it a medium cavalry unit, because the base damage is not all that high, either on the regular or the elite version. The melee armor is pretty good though, 2 and 3 respectively for regular and elite, and it has 2 pierce armor no matter what version of the unit you have. The rate of fire is 2.0 and the speed is 1.4, so it's not that slow either, it's got some speed to it. Though it's not quite as fast as, say, like cav archers, camels, scouts, that kind of thing, but it's slightly faster than knight. Now, the way the bonus works is that you gain +1 bonus damage, or for the elite +2, versus infantry per every unit you've killed up to a maximum of 10, which means the regular Gaudraut tops out at 10 bonus damage, and the elite version tops out at +20. So what I want to do here is think about how the Gaudraut plays out against its primary counter unit, the Spear Line. And in Castle Age, what this is going to look like is that the Gaudraut with 0 to 1 kills takes 7 hits to kill a pikeman. With 2 kills, that goes down to 6, and I believe that knights kill pikemen in about 6 hits, so we've kind of got up now to how good a knight is. But with the Gaudraut, you get 3 to 5, you can kill pikemen in 5 hits, and if you have 4 to 10 kills, you can kill in 4 hits. So you can do really nicely against pikemen, but remember you're still taking all of their bonus damage. So it's a better trade, right? But you might still have to trade some HP. Additionally, in the Imperial Age, thinking about the elite Gaudraut versus halberdiers, with 0 kills you kill in 6 hits, with 1 to 2 kills you kill in 5 hits, and I believe cavaliers kill halberdiers in 5 hits, so we're getting, again, caught back up pretty quickly. 3 to 4 kills allows you to kill halberdiers in 4 hits. 5 to 9 kills allows you to kill them in 3. And if you can get to that magic number of 10, you can kill halbs in 2 hits, right? Now remember, you don't just have to kill infantry to rack this up. This is just how many units that the Gaudraut has killed overall. So let's think about how this unit compares with probably its most similar counterpart here, another cavalry unit that's kind of specializing against infantry, Cataphract. And the elite Gaudraut, if you have those 10 kills, can kill halberdiers in 1.93 hits, and the elite Cataphract's doing it in 2.6. So an elite Gaudraut with 10 kills is actually, in terms of just the damage, is killing faster than even the Cataphract. However, the elite Gaudraut dies to halbs in, basically 5 hits. It's about 4.4. And the elite Cataphract dies to halbs in 8 hits. So Cataphracts are going to have more durability, and even though they might take 1 extra hit to have to kill, they're going to survive, say, 3 extra hits. Now remember with the elite Gaudraut, right? It's a little bit cheaper than the Cataphract. It's a little bit faster, and it has that 2 pierce armor, which is really, really crucial. So it has some things going for it, And the reason that it has a little bit more durability and speed is because with the Goudraut, to really get to this point where the unit is pretty strong, you have to keep it alive. And so we need the durability to be there a bit more. Now, because the Goudraut is more designed for survival, the Cataphract has much more of an advantage in terms of its base damage, with a faster firing rate and with Logistica getting trample damage. So in the end, right, Goudrauts really prize durability and trying to stay alive, and if you can achieve that, then that's when they become pretty good versus infantry. But the Cataphracts are still, I think, the more consistent and ultimately better specialists versus infantry, right? Additionally, they put out a bit more damage if you can get there, right? But they're going to lack that durability. So again, we have two units that are doing something similar, but they're doing it in a different way. And so I think the Goudraut winds up being pretty unique as a result. Now, let's talk about unique technologies for a moment, starting with the Castle Age technology Moorish Auxiliaries, and this reduces the gold cost of camel riders by 50%. Again, what we want to reflect here is the fact that we would have camels as either conscripts or auxiliaries in the Vandal army, and what this does is it makes your camel riders very cheap against cavalry in that kind of late Castle Age, early Imperial Age time frame. But you got to remember, right, that the Vandals lack heavy camel rider as an upgrade. So I think that that's really what balances this thing out. And we can think about this kind of in line with the Poles Sláinte Privileges technology. And I want to take a moment and compare the two units in the Imperial Age. So let's think about Vandal camel riders and Polish heavy cavalry for a second. The Castle Age Vandal camel riders also benefit from Gambesons, which of course you have to research, but that gives them a little bit more durability versus crossbow, but you're going to lag behind heavy cavalry like knights, and also Vandal light cavalry. And you can see, right, Vandal camel riders take 30 shots, but knights and Vandal light cav are still doing quite a bit better. And in the late game, right, Vandal camel riders are taking about as many shots from an arbalist as heavy camel riders. So again, you shouldn't notice that much change there, but you are doing less damage, so you won't take out archers as fast. And Vandal camel riders do lose to generic fully upgraded cavalier by about 1 hit. But remember, if you have the Castle Age tech researched, it's going to be a really nice trade. And I think overall, that means that the Vandal camel riders are situationally efficient, right? If you have a lot of cavalry out there, being able to get this tech, make a lot of camels, can be a pretty decent move. For the Poles, on the other hand, right, your Knights and Castle Age are fully upgraded. You take about the same number of shots from an arbalist in the late game as even, say, a camel rider. And the Poles Cavalier also, because it misses that last armor upgrade, slightly loses to generic fully upgraded Cavalier too. So these units have some similarities, but the Poles Heavy Cavalry is going to be much more of a generalist because of its higher base attack and, having a bit more melee armor as well, in terms of its base. So, it's going to be, these are both still, decent units, but I think it's sort of the specialist in this case with the Vandal camels versus maybe the more generalist fighter in the Cavalier for the Poles. Okay, now this next technology is a little bit of a weird one, but rock with me here for a minute. The Vandals' unique tech in the Imperial Age is called Vandalism. What does it do? It causes enemy relics to jettison from the monasteries and be rescattered across the map, and now Vandal swordsmen can go ahead and pick them up. What I want to do here is bake in, right, the fact that, hey, looting treasure during the sack of Rome, something we gotta involve with the Vandals, I think, in some way, and this is how we're going to do it. What does this mean? This is essentially a second chance to contest relics that your enemy got. So this is one of those Imperial Age technologies that I think has a wide range of possible outcomes. Basically, when you research this tech, if you can collect those relics or keep your opponent from collecting them, you've drastically reduced their gold income if the game goes late. On the other hand, right, if it just winds up that your enemy collects them back again pretty quickly, well, then you actually might not even recoup the cost of the tech, or maybe just kind of come out even on the end. So it really just depends. And something to keep in mind, right, is that swordsmen, right, that can now pick up relics for Vandals, move faster than monks, but they could get converted by a monk. So you might need to, say, send a light cav as maybe, to rock with your, say, like if you make a militia, just so it can go pick up a rook. All right, now let me take a look at the technology tree, starting with the archery range, and I'm just going to be blunt about this. The Vandal archery range might be the worst one in Age of Empires 2. You miss crossbow and arbalist, so that's bad, but you're also missing elite skirmisher, so this is terrible. Now, having said that, the way that we kind of give the Vandals something is that they also have access to the Genitors, like the Berbers, whose presence is reflected essentially into their armies. Now, keep in mind, right, it's sort of like the Berbers also has access to elite skirmishers, so they're still good, right? Vandals, on the other hand, are forced to rely on the Genitors in order to, if you wanted to counter, archer threats with something from the archery range. It's also worth noting that in Castle Age, your cavalry archers can get full upgrades, so you can play that in the mid game, but you lack access to the heavy cavalry archer, so it really doesn't scale. The barracks is good, it's fully upgraded, except for missing some regional units, and you have that nice food economy from the Vandal TCs to help you maybe with the men-at-arms opening. The stable, and I'm including the Gouger on the screen because it's a cavalry unit, but keep in mind it is created from the castle. You have a number of options here, and this is really your bread and butter. Fully upgraded paladins are fantastic, give you that really nice population efficient option. I talked earlier about the light cavalry and camel riders that benefit from gambesons. Keep in mind that you miss hussar and heavy camel rider to compensate, and remember the Gouger is available from the castle. So your melee cavalry with the Vandals is really the unit that you want to make the focal point of your army, and each cavalry unit for the Vandals serves a very different purpose. The Paladin is your strongest option, but it's also your most expensive, and it's going to be weak versus counter units like camels and halberdiers because it's fully upgraded, but it's generic. The light cavalry are going to be strong versus archers, a nice cost-efficient option in that regard, but you're missing hussar, so you're going to have to watch out for camels and halbs once again. Now, we can use the Vandal Camel Rider, benefiting from gambesons. It's going to be good versus those light and I would say medium cavalry units, and it'll be cost-efficient versus heavy cavalry. But you got to watch out for a number of counters. Halberdiers, stronger camels are going to be something to deal with, and also the fact that even with gambesons, you're still not performing awesome against archers. And when we get to the Gouger, this is a unit that is pretty darn strong versus infantry, should be decent against archers, a little bit more of a population efficient option there, but it's going to be weak against heavy cavalry and also camels, so you're going to have to watch out there. And if you don't rack up the kills with this unit, then it's not going to be good versus the spear line either, so it's potentially strong versus infantry. Taking a look at the Siege Workshop, got a number of options here. Basically, you have some units at your disposal, but you're just missing those really heavy offensive and defensive options in Siege Onagers and Bombard Cannons. The dock is really good early. You have the Fire Galleys with more HP. You're going to be building up food with the Town Center Eco bonus to kind of get to the Castle Age. And you also get that really nice early Imperial power spike with free shipwright. And remember, the Dromans also have extra HP. Where it gets kind of funky for the civilization is that you miss access to galleons, forcing you to rely on the two units that you have that are, by design, a little bit stronger. So you want to keep that in mind. Those galleon plus demo ship combinations can be something that you're going to want to have a big enough navy to stop. Mix in those Dromans, maybe mix in demo ships of your own, right? Again, you do have heavy demo, so you might think about that. And you do have more HP on some units, but no galleons is a pretty big hole in that tech tree, but you have some things to compensate for. When it comes to the monastery, it's okay. It gets weaker as you go on. No block printing is a big deal, and your castles are not that strong. You miss hoardings, though it is worth noting you do get some pretty decent towers in here, and you do get heated shot, but you are missing some, things like fortified walls as well, missing architecture. So this is a civ that is probably not the best for, say, like turtling up and just relying on your buildings to keep you safe. You want to fight with this civ. The economy's good. You have all the eco upgrades available, and this really helps balance the civ out because your food bonus really starts to fall off. I think somewhere in late Castle Age, unless you're on just a boatload of TCs. So having all the economic upgrades, I think you have to invest in them, but it can kind of help offset what is otherwise maybe not the best mid game economy. Okay, so now let me talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the Civ, and then I'll get into strategies. Basically, you have a nice economy in the early to mid game. Your melee cavalry units have not only a lot of versatility, but in a lot of cases are either pretty strong overall, or at least they specialize in a certain area. You have a strong navy, I think, at a number of points in the game. This could also be a good pocket for team games, and your siege, it's not bad. I will also say to keep in mind, right, the fact that you can recontest those enemy relics later does really open up the possibilities in the late game, so you're just not stuck with an opponent that collected all the relics before you and now you can't do anything about it. Now when it comes to weaknesses, there's quite a few. The food bonus, as I mentioned, really slows down. The archery range is basically a horror movie. You are, outside of Paladin, missing some power with the Civ, right? Hussar and heavy camel riders, right? You're not able to get those upgrades, so you're gonna kind of be stuck with, maybe some lesser units there. Even though they can specialize in a few ways, they're not the best generalist fighters. Additionally, right, when we think about the Navy, you don't have a direct wood bonus. In team games, yeah, you have fully upgraded paladins, but there's nothing that special about them, so they'll probably die to civs, say like Franks or maybe Lithuanians with a bunch of relics or Teutons. And when it comes to siege, even though you have options, you're lacking those the big ticket items there. And it is important to keep in mind as well, the infantry it's fully upgraded, but it is generic with the Civ. So, that's something, hey, you have fully upgraded helps, but you just don't have really anything special outside of your swordsman maybe in late game being able to pick up some relics, which is pretty neat. Alright, so let me talk about strategies here. I think in the early game, right, you want to use that food bonus for probably scouts and men-at-arms openings. And I will say that because the bonus is decreasing through the ages, then that really does provide some incentive to stay in feudal age a little bit longer, so you might try that with the Civ. In the mid game, I think this is really about getting some TCs so that your food economy doesn't kind of grind to a halt and you kind of feel like you're in the doldrums. And I will also say, right, you want to go with those mounted melee units, and you have a number of options. I think that many of them scale decently into the late game, though you have to be careful with your camel riders especially, because unless your opponent is making a lot of cavalry, then they're probably not going to be very good, right? So it's a pretty specialist unit. But the other options, right, I think you can actually dive into and not be too worried. Now, moving into the late game, the formula is simple in structure, but in terms of actually sort of filling in the notes here, is a little bit more complicated. Basically, what you want is you want that mounted melee unit, and then you probably want some combination of Genitor or Halberdier. But figuring out which one to go for requires a bit more thought. And so, again, Paladins, they're expensive, but they're your most powerful option. Light Cavalry with Gambesons, right, help you with those archers, and you might need to add in Genitors to defend versus Halberdiers, and because Genitors are a bit more expensive on the food, right, that could be an army that costs a bit to afford, but it is a trash army at the end of the day. Additionally, cheap Camel Riders with the Gambesons is a pretty good trade versus Cavaliers, just trading slightly below average. But if you're up against Paladins, it's still going to be cost effective, but you're just going to need numbers to win those fights. Now remember, with cheap camels, right, Halberdiers are going to absolutely obliterate them. So you're going to want to make sure that you either add in your own Halberdiers to kind of soak up that damage, but the truth is that you probably need to add in Genitors. Now, if the opponent commits to pikemen, right, you're going to want to make sure that if you're playing Gougetts, you keep them alive, or, right, you find ways to kill other units with Gougetts so you can start building up that bonus damage and not die to pikemen too early. Now, it could be the case that you could maybe go something, say, like Gougetts and Halberdiers could be decent. If your opponent's, say, going for something like, like Knight plus Hal, it could be an option for you. But if the opponent is Arbalest, right, the Gougett will be good, but you also might consider adding in Genitors or your own light cavalry. That's going to be good versus archers as well. So again, you could have some pretty varied unit comps there, but the formula is still basically the same. And where I think the civilization can really struggle a little bit is versus heavy cav archer and hussar. I think the best comp the Vandals have against that is the cheap camel riders and light cavalry, because the camel riders will do a little bit of bonus damage, and the light cavalry are going to benefit from gambesons. But I think this unit comp you have to play in a way that is a bit more tactical, where you try to get the camel riders on top of the cav archers, and or alternatively, you want the light cavalry to make sure they're soaking up all those arrows, but not fighting the hussars from the other civ, because remember, because you don't get hussars, your light cav will lose to other civilizations' light cav. So this is kind of a tricky one, but I think that there are situations where you can win it, but it's going to come down a lot more to troop movement than, say, we have two sort of, we just kind of send armies running into one another. You're going to have to be a bit more tactical here. And the last thing, the late game, to always keep in mind, right? Researching vandalism can help you reset the relic advantage if you are at a disadvantage, and maybe slow down your opponent's relic income just a little bit. But you're gonna have to keep in mind, right? If you do it, you want to make sure that you can go ahead and try to grab those relics. So you want to be ready for it. Okay, so now that you know what the civ design looks like, I want to talk about some ideas that I considered, but decided just didn't fit what I had. The first thing is that I thought about giving military units a gold bonus for, say, killing other units or buildings. But while I think historically that makes some sense, that kind of economic bonus I think is incredibly inconsistent. And oftentimes it winds up either necessitating a second economic bonus, which if both are working in tandem, can be pretty overpowered, or if it's the only economic bonus, you will probably find some times where it feels like you don't have an economic bonus at all. Say your opponent gets really walled up, that kind of thing. So I just didn't like it for balance purposes. Additionally, I thought of an infantry unique unit that pillaged in some form or fashion. And I thought about two ways of doing that. One is to generate resources while it attacked, but that seemed like it's a little too played out by, say, Keshik or Viking chieftains with their infantry, and I just wanted a unique unit that stood out a bit more. Now, I thought about allowing the unit to steal resources from villagers, right? So maybe, if you kill a villager, the resources get added to your account, or maybe just some percentage of them. The reason I didn't go with that is that I just didn't find a good way to balance it, and thinking about how its combat performance should be. And I don't know, I just never really got a feel for it that made sense to me. Additionally, the Vandals, the fact that you lack elite skirmisher and crossbowmen, creates a weakness versus both infantry and archers that I think the civ needs to fill. And when I thought about how to do that with an infantry unique unit, if you gave it a bonus versus infantry, it feels already done by the Jaguar warriors and not unique enough. And additionally, if you had an infantry unique unit with a bonus versus archers, well, Huskarls and Gulam are already doing that. So once again, not something I like. So the way that I wanted to approach it was let the cavalry and Genitors fill in those roles, and then the Gaudraut is the unit, right, that's really the cherry on top here. So you have light cavalry with Gambesons that can help you do with crossbow and arbalist, but that's not going to be as good versus hand cannoneers late, right, because you don't have quite the HP of a Hussar. It'll be okay, but still not great. Now, Genitors are going to be good versus archer and spear units, right? So you have a counter against hand cannons there, but remember, Genitors are not going to have offensive potential. And that's why the Gaudraut comes in, right? The Gaudraut, if you can keep some veteran Gaudraut that have a number of kills in your army, you'll find that you'll do pretty well versus infantry. Plus, this is a durable unit, and with that 2 pierce armor, it should be able to handle itself well versus units like Arbalists that are doing that pierce damage, but also hand cannoneers that they're doing kind of large chunks of pierce damage. Additionally, the Gaudraut has enough damage, I think, to be able to kill villagers still and kind of raid at the same time. So I think that between all of this, we kind of cover the civilization's weaknesses. I also considered giving the civ a Vandal Bowman to kind of replace the fact that you don't have elite skirmisher and crossbow, but frankly, I just couldn't find a good basis for it, and so I wound up ditching that idea. Continuing on, I thought about giving them decent cav archers, right? Again, this brings the Allens back into things. And while that makes sense, so many things that I read actually suggested that the Vandals were just hideously bad at anything other than hand-to-hand combat. And they actually, when they fought against civilizations like the Moors, really struggled against mounted archers. I think when Belisarius is handing the Vandals an L in the wars in the 6th century AD, I think he brings actually over some Hun mounted archers that really perplex the Vandals. So yeah, this is just it just didn't make sense to me historically. And also the fact that if we want to leave open the idea of having the Allens as a separate civ that either comes in with the Vandals or maybe later, I just felt like that would be a bit too much overlap. And moving on, I considered that free shipwright might be too strong. I did a little bit of math on it, and I looked at the Italians and what their bonuses look like. And basically, the Italians' bonuses are definitely better than the Vandals in terms of resource savings. But it is worth keeping in mind that shipwright's still pretty good here because, again, you're getting it for free. It's a nice power spike bonus, so you don't really have to invest in it to get it. I also considered allowing the Castle Age technology Moorish auxiliaries to lower the cost of Genitors, but to me, that just defeated the purpose. I really want Vandals to feel forced to rely on Genitors, and essentially if you lower the cost on them, then it just winds up being a better skirmisher at that point. And I didn't like that, right? I want Genitors to be whatever their normal base cost is, so that you really have to think about if that's a unit you want to make with the Vandals, so it's there for you if you need it, but in exchange for a more population efficient option, you got to pay a bit more of a price for it. Okay, now what I want to do here at the end is talk about some comparisons with other civilization concepts. I'm not going to go into any of these in great detail, but just kind of consider, where we were the same and where we're different. And I really only found 2 concepts out there, so I don't think that a lot of people are thinking about the Vandals, but, they probably should be. Basically, I think that we all kind of hit the main points, things like cavalry, some plundering mechanic, good navy, and I will say the concepts that I saw earlier, pretty much all of them had the idea as the Droman as a unique unit, depending on whatever you might call it something different, but the same basic unit, and now we have that in the game, so props to everybody who's done a Vandal concept sort of video or Reddit post, at least the ones that I read. Where my design is different, I think, is the emphasis leaning not so much into the association with the Allens, which would lead to better cavalry archers, but like I mentioned earlier, I leaned more into the sort of incorporating the more North African side of the military strategy. And again, why did I do that? Well, one was because of things that I read, and I also felt like this caused the Vandals to be a little too close in resemblance to the Huns, and I just didn't like the way that felt because, Huns have a good stable, and so if you have decent cav archers with the Vandals, it's not that different from Huns at this point, so I just didn't really like to go down that road. So again, right, I went into a bit more of association, and with the sort of, the Moors, who, even though I'm almost positive that the Moors and the Berbers are technically different, right? For the purposes of Age of Empires 2, probably are bracketed together. And as a result, my civilization design both brings in some of those North African elements, but also I think makes the Vandals still kind of struggle against civilizations that would have those sort of like mounted archer, mounted skirmisher, light cavalry kinds of tech trees that are just better than what the Vandals have. So I think I really achieved what I wanted to on that point with the civ design. I will also say that other civilizations put more of an emphasis on the infantry than I did, and basically the reason that I went away from that is while I do think that makes a lot of sense for the Vandals if you want to lean more into their early years, but once they're really at their high point, they've at this point, at least from everything I'd read, they definitely transitioned to really being a cavalry sort of civilization, and I think a lot of that's a consequence of wealth, and so it just made more sense to me. Now, I did like the idea of infantry kind of like wandering off with treasure from other civilizations, so I built that into the Imperial Age tech. Alright, so now let's wrap things up here. I think with the Vandal Civ design that we've got here in this video that I've explained to you, I really think this is one of the most unique civs in the game. We have a combination of unit types that I just don't think that we've seen in the game. And I describe the Vandals as being good at what they do, things like mounted cavalry, and really awful at the things that they don't do, like, foot archers or even mounted archers, right? The Gentaur's fine, but again, it's still going to cost some resources. And I think this will be a competitive civ, but I don't think it's going to be overpowering in any particular aspect. The TC bonus, with the food, as I went through earlier, it compares to other civs early on, but as you can see, it kind of tapers off. You have a number of cavalry options. You have a strong navy early and late, maybe a lull in the mid game, and it still has some holes because you miss galleons. I really see the Vandals as a civ that would just be fun to play in pretty much any format. In 1v1s, all of the mobility is going to create fast-paced games, and I think having the unique tech kind of creating a place to go after relics again, possibly in the late game, that is, I think that keeps those Imperial Ages a little bit, fresh and a bit more dynamic. I think in team games, having access to fully upgraded paladins, and also you got to remember, knowing that you're slowing down your opponent's trade is something that I think would just be really fun. Unless maybe you're playing against the Vandals and you're probably going to be griping about it. So, make sure that you, have Spanish as a teammate. I also think that the Vandals, right, that just in terms of thinking about campaign and just, the sort of sense of wonder that it provides to the game, they're a civ that they really got around town, they saw the world, encountered a number of people, they stood up, right, to the Roman Empire, and they're an important historical civilization, and I really do think that this would be a great civ to have in Age of Empires 2 DE. That being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks definitely for watching. If you're listening to this and, kind of jamming into the music, right, however you like to enjoy my videos, I appreciate it. And yeah, JimmyJames59, and I'll be doing more of these. I have other videos coming. So with that being said, until next time, I'll see you out there in the lab. Peace.